Hello guys, buenos días, buenas tardes, or buenas noches. Welcome to another Spanish 101 video. Today's topic is rather long, but I think that the way we have studied verbs previously has prepared us sufficiently for doing this whole thing in one go. Okay? So, what we're going to do today is study a very special group of verbs that are regular verbs, meaning they do follow a pattern, but the pattern changes slightly as compared to the ones we have already studied, as compared to the normal ar, and ir verbs. Okay? So today we're going to study stem changing verbs. First, I'm going to remind you yet again of the procedure we have studied for conjugating regular verbs. And I'm just going to do a normal ar verb, okay? So bear with me. I know that this can be repetitive, but I do think that repetition can be useful. So cantar. Cantar means to sing, right? And this is a regular ar verb. So let's remember what the procedure is for conjugating this thing. The first step, remember, is getting rid of the last two letters of the infinitive, the form of the verb that always ends in ar, or ir. So in this case, we get rid of the a and the r. And then what we are left with is the stem of the verb, right? Remember that term. The stem of the verb is what you're left with after you get rid of the ending of the infinitive. So the stem of cantar is cant, right? And then I use the stem everywhere, right? I use it for all the 6 forms of the verb. And the one thing that changes is the endings. O, as, a, amos, an are the ar endings. And I'm adding those endings to cantar because the infinitive ends in ar, which tells me that this is an ar verb, right? This is review, right? This is the procedure we have studied, and we know already that this is what we need to do with regular verbs, and the only thing that changes is the endings if the verb belongs to a different group. If the verb is an verb like comer, we need the endings. If the verb is an ir verb like vivir, we need the ir endings, right? Okay. Moving on to the actual topic of the day. What are stem changing verbs? Well, their name tells us what they are, right? They are verbs in which the stem, meaning that fragment of verb that is left after we get rid of the end of the infinitive, right? They are verbs in which the stem does not remain the same. Verbs in which that stem undergoes some changes, but those changes are always minor, right? And they still follow a pattern. That is why we consider them regular verbs, okay? They're not irregular. We do not need to memorize the whole thing. We just need to study the pattern. So we're basically, with stem changing verbs, adding one more step to our little procedure, but it's the same procedure. Okay? So there are 3 groups of stem changing verbs, and we're going to do the 3 of them today. The first group is called the E to IE stem changing verbs. Sometimes I recommend students to learn these using the Spanish sounds of the vowels and not the English, right? Because that can be helpful. So If you think it will not confuse you, you can learn these as the E to IE stem changing verbs instead of the E to IE. Okay, but whatever you choose, just it's important that you know these names because these names basically contain the information you need for conjugating them, right? Everything is in the name of the group. So the first group is the E to IE stem changing verbs. Let's do one of these, a very important verb, querer. Querer. This means to want, okay? So what do I do in order to conjugate this verb? It's quite simple. We start with the step we already know. We get rid of the ending of the infinitive, right? We get rid of the E, we get rid of the R. So what is the stem of the verb? Yes, we know it's quer, right? It's what's left of the verb after we get rid of the ending of the infinitive. Quer is the stem of querer, right? However, querer is not your standard regular verb. It is an E to IE stem changing verb. What do I mean by this? Let's look at the actual conjugation of querer. You have it right here. Yo quiero, tú quieres, él, ella quiere, nosotros queremos, ustedes quieren, ellos quieren, right? This might sound like it's all over the place, but we're actually following a pattern here, a very simple pattern, right? Let's focus first on what is happening to the stem, just the stem, right? We know that the stem is quer, Q-U-E-R, right? But it's changing, right? Let's look at how it changes exactly. Let's look specifically at this region of the stem, right? If you look at it carefully, you'll see that the changes that are happening are minor. Basically, the E that you find in the stem is changing for an IE, right? Instead of just E, you have IE. Well, that is why I told you that everything is in the name of the group, right? This is an E to IE stem changing verb, which means that the E in the stem changes to IE. That's all, right? However, if you look at it carefully, you will see that this is not happening everywhere, right? It's happening everywhere except for one form of the verb, the nosotros form, okay? This is very important. This is a rule that applies to all stem changing verbs. The change of the stem occurs everywhere except for the nosotros form, okay? The nosotros form does not undergo the change in the stem. It remains the same. So the step we are adding for conjugating stem changing verbs is quite simple, right? We're just making the change to the stem that the name of the group dictates. This group being the E to IE group, we change the E in the stem for an IE. But we need to remember that we do not apply that change to the nosotros form. All the others undergo the change. The nosotros form stays the same. Okay? And that's all. Basically get rid of the two last letters of the infinitive in order to obtain the stem. And do the same thing with these verbs that we have done with the other regular verbs, but remembering to make the changes to the stem that the name of the group tells us to do. And remember also not to apply that change to the nosotros form. Okay? Good. That's all good and dandy, but you might be wondering, well, what about the endings? Where did these endings come from, right? Because we've been talking about the stem exclusively, but we know from the procedure we already learned that the endings are very important, right? Where did these endings come from? Well, you know them already. They are the endings, right? Querer is an verb, so we are applying the endings. Okay? So this is the second very important rule for stem changing verbs. They always use the standard endings for regular verbs of their type, okay? You do not need to learn new sets of endings for these verbs. You just have to make the changes to the stem, and when you move on to adding the endings, it's the same endings that you have already studied. So if the infinitive ends in ar, you add the ar endings. If the infinitive ends in er, you add the er endings. If it ends in ir, you add the ir endings. Okay? So for example, querer, it ends in er, so that's why we are adding the er endings. But not all e to I stem changing verbs are er verbs, right? For example, we have calentar, which means to heat up, right? And, like heating up your food or something, right? So it is an E to IE stem changing verb, but it's also an AR verb, right? So I make the changes to the stem and I also add the AR endings, okay? Let's look at a couple more examples of E to IE stem changing verbs so that you see what I mean with this rule about the endings. Let's look at entender, for example. It means to understand. And this is its conjugation. What did I do here? It's quite simple, right? I got rid of the last two letters of the infinitive, so I got rid of the R and the E. By doing that, I obtained the stem, which is entend, right? And then since I know that it's an E to IE stem changing verb, I applied all those changes. Applied those changes to all the forms except for the nosotros form, right? What about the endings? Well, it's an er verb, entender. So I added the er endings, os, e, hemos, en. Okay, that's what I did. Now another very important E to IE stem changing verb, mentir, which means to lie, right? What did I do here? What did I do here? Well, exactly the same thing we've done with the other one, right? Got rid of the last two letters of the infinitive, obtained the stem, applied the changes in the stem everywhere but the nosotros form. However, the endings I applied are not the er endings because it's mentir, not menter, right? It's an ir verb. So I added the ir endings. That is why the nosotros form is mentimos and not mentemos, right? Okay, so very, very important. Always remember that. Stem changing verbs have that special rule about the stem, but what is going to tell you what endings to apply is, as usual, the ending of their infinitive. Okay, if it's an ar verb, you add the ar endings. If it's an er verb, you add the er endings. If it's an ir verb, you add the ir endings. Okay, good. I hope that's clear. As always, you can go back in video and watch this first section again if you have some doubts. But as I said, we're going to do all three groups of stem changing verbs today, right? It's a lot of material that we're doing in the same video, I know. But I think it makes sense because actually all of these work in the same way. We did the E to IE stem changing verbs. Let's do the second group, the O to UE stem changing verbs, right? You should already know what we're going to do here because it's always the same procedure. Let me give you the verb. It's called mover, which means to move, right? It's very, very similar to its English counterpart. So what am I going to do? You already know this. You already know this. I don't need to tell you. I'm going to tell you, however, for the sake of completeness. So what do? I get rid of the E and the R. I obtain the stem of the verb. And then, since I know that this is an O to UE stem changing verb, I apply those changes to the stem. And since I know that it's an er ending, it's an er verb, I add the er endings. That's all, right? How exactly is the stem changing? Well, let's look again at the part of the stem that is changing. Move is the actual stem, so it has that O in the middle. I'm just changing that O for an UE everywhere, but here, because that's the rule. Don't change the nosotros form, right? And then I said I added the er endings. That is why the endings I'm adding are o, es, e, hemos, en, because it's an er verb, mover, right? So yo muevo, I move, tú mueves, you move, él mueve, he moves, ella mueve, she moves, nosotros movemos, we move. Ustedes mueven, you guys move, ellos mueven, they move, right? So it's exactly the same procedure as the E to IE stem changing verbs. I'm just making a different change in the stem. How do I know what change to make? Well, the very name of the group told me, right? Now, how do I know that a verb belongs to a certain group? Well, basically that information I need to learn when I learn the verb. So you're going to get a vocab list, right? Which will list verbs from each of these three groups, and it will tell you, basically it will be three separate lists, one of each of the groups, and as you learn the meaning, you also learn that it's a stem changing verb and what group it belongs to. So that way, when you encounter the verb, you will know to apply the changes that it needs, okay? So these are the O to UE stem changing verbs, right? Sorry, there's a mistake here. It's O to UE stem changing verbs, right? Let's do encontrar, right? So I'm taking that O in the stem, encontrar, and changing it for UE. So encuentro, encuentras, encuentra, encontramos, encuentran, encuentran. I did not change the nosotros form, and I applied the ar endings. Another example, dormir. Again, O to UE stem changing verb, right? So it's not yo dormo, it's yo duermo. It's not tú dormes, it's tú duermes, right? I changed that O for an UE, and I do not change it for nosotros because that is the rule, dormimos, right? And where did these endings come from? From the ir endings, right? Because it's dormir, okay? It's quite simple actually, right? You just need to know what stem changing verb group each verb belongs to, right? So just study that list that you will be getting from me, right? One third and final group of stem changing verbs is the E to I stem changing verbs. A very important verb here, pedir, which is to ask for or to request something, right? Very, very important, right? Many times you have to ask someone for a favor, right? Or for, as simple as asking your classmates for a pen, right? So how does this work? You already know. Again, we just follow the same procedure as always. We take the infinitive, we get rid of those last two letters. That way we obtain the stem of the verb. The stem of pedir is ped. And now we remember that this is an E to I stem changing verb. So what do I do? Well, I take the verb, I add the ir endings, right? And I make these changes. Notice that the E is changing to an I everywhere but here, because that's the rule, right? So it's yo pido instead of yo pedo, tú pides instead of tú pedes, etc., etc., right? I change the E for an I. And I add the ir endings because it's pedir, it ends in ir, right? Actually, incidentally, all verbs that belong to this group are ir verbs. Okay, so in this one you don't even need to make that mental step of thinking about what endings to add and looking at the infinitive, right? You just add ir endings. But I would recommend actually that you do not get used to not thinking about that because you will have to apply it in all the other stem changing verbs, right? So just add the endings, think about the infinitive, and that will give you the information about what endings to add, okay? That is the procedure for conjugating stem changing verbs. Okay? So to recap, basically we have three groups of stem changing verbs. We have E to IE stem changing verbs. We have O to UE stem changing verbs. And we have E to I stem changing verbs. Those are the three groups. And what is the procedure for conjugating them? Very simply stated, just follow the same rules you already learned. The rules you already know for other regular verbs. Only remember to make the changes to the stem that are dictated by the name. So if it's an E to an IE, take that E, change it for an IE. For IE, sorry. If it's an O to UE, take that O in the stem and change it for a UE. If it's E for an I, exactly, the E to I, exactly the same, take that E that you find in the stem, change it for an I, right? And that's it. And always remember, because I have encountered students that have this confusion, they are stem changing verbs, right? This has to do with the stem, not the endings, right? The endings remain the ones that you know, right? So if it's an adverb, you use ad endings. If it's an adverb, you use ed. If it's an adverb, you use ed, and that has nothing to do with the stem, right? The endings are totally separate from the stem. They come together in the conjugation, but they're totally different concepts, right? So don't start thinking that you have to take that O in the ending and change it for something. That's not the way it works. We're talking about the stem, okay? Good. I know this is a lot. I know that this has been a lot of information, but I do think that you are prepared for doing this and for doing this all together, right? I actually think that this is the best way to learn this group of verbs because the actual procedure is simple. You just have to remember what group the verb belongs to. Okay? Muchas gracias, muchachos. Hasta luego.